Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here with our next mini lesson, and it is finally time for us to discuss the significant second New Deal. Yes, there's not just one, we actually get two of them, thanks to Mr. FDR and his interesting cigarette holders there. Alright, so let's get started. So what we're going to be looking here at in the second New Deal is FDR's creation of the second New Deal in the context of its continuing struggles his and the country's continuing struggles in the Great Depression. Okay, so as you're going to see here, there's a little bit of drama, FDR kind of doing some maybe debatable or constitutional things. So we're going to have this question: do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to do something bad to accomplish something good? All right, so with that little thought moving us on here. So the intention of the second New Deal. What most historians tend to focus on is kind of three kind of big ideas, and then kind of like one underlying one. And John Kennedy, with kind of his most kind of like, I guess, recent synthesis of FDR, and then in both pre-war and then after war, has kind of basically said that it's for society. He wants security. He wants people to be safe, that they have a feeling of this, like they have a feeling of a good like social safety net. In the economy, he wants things regulated, so that kind of goes back to some progressive ideas from beforehand. In the like physical realm, not meaning just like the environment, but also like building and construction, he wants development to happen, but the most common objective for the second New Deal overall was stability. And this is what John Kennedy does say about it. Roosevelt's dream was the old progressive dream of wringing order out of chaos, seeking mastery rather than accepting drift, imparting to ordinary Americans at least some measure of the kind of predictability to their lives. And again, this is, if you can imagine like a person living through the Depression, this is kind of what you want, because your life has been very chaotic and very crazy for at least the last 10 years by the time that the Great Depression is really in full swing. Okay, so let's talk about the Big Bill. Okay, the Big Bill was Roosevelt's name for the essentially the big bill that was in the second New Deal. So it contains a whole bunch of legislation, which most of it I'm not going to be able to detail here, but most or best known out of them is going to be the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and then also the Wagner Act. And something else that was part of the second New Deal, but not part of the Big Bill, was something called the Social Security Act. And we're going to talk about this one as well. Okay. Now, why this is kind of interesting here is you can actually see that the WPA, this is a good example of a poster from it, and it's pretty awesome. It says, "John is not really dull, he may only need his eyes examined," and it was paid for by the WPA Federal Art Project. So let's get into the WPA. Okay, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Yes, the Works Progress Administration. Its purpose was employment. Roughly about 8.5 million Americans get put to work through the WPA. Now, how this works is also a little bit controversial. So what it does is essentially the federal government. This act, what it allows is that the federal government could dish out money to then local governments to contract out work. And why this is controversial is because anytime that you give local governments money, patronage is going to become a big thing. And we know that, talking about political machines and patronage from before, that anytime that you're going to have money introduced into local politics, it's going to be pretty controversial, because the local politicians who are in charge, whether they be Democrats or Republicans at this time, the money is going to go to certain people and it's not going to go to others. And so it is pretty controversial at the time, but we do get some really interesting artwork that they basically, in many cases, will pay artists during this time to go off and do their paintings. And there's actually a bunch of these in U.S. post offices around the United States today, and this is one from the Times. And I've actually asked if Beech Grove has a painting in their post office, and apparently they do not, but that would be really cool if there was. Okay, now let's talk about the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act kind of ties into a lot of the stuff that we did at the beginning of the semester with labor unions. And what the Wagner Act did is it ensures that workers could unionize, okay, but also more importantly, it creates a national labor board to work out problems between businesses and labor. And the reason why this is a big deal for FDR and why he particularly wants this one passed is there was a whole history of strikes during the Great Depression. And this makes sense because if you're a worker and you've been going through the Great Depression, you've had your wages cut, you've had your hours cut, or you've been laid off. And so for Roosevelt, making sure that workers could unionize, but then also making sure that there was a method by which business and labor could meet and then talk was a way for not only to make sure that people kept their jobs, but a way to keep wages high for the people who were working. So the Wagner Act does have some kind of important kind of like long-term consequences in terms of like how we think about the United States relationship between business and labor and kind of like negotiating between the two. Okay, now we cannot talk about the Second New Deal, even though it wasn't part of the big bill, without discussing the Social Security Act. Okay, I think you can probably say that the Social Security Act was probably is the most influential government program ever, besides maybe Reconstruction, and we can even say maybe it's more than that because it's still going right now. Now, if you don't know how Social Security works, if you don't have a part-time job, essentially what happens is that everybody's wages that you earn in the United States are partially taxed through what's called the Social Security tax, and that tax is taken out of your paychecks, and then it's stored into a system that pays for the people that are currently retiring right now. And so what it does is essentially gives you funds, it gives you a pension for you when you retire. And this is massively transformative because the idea that the government was going to pay people once they retired was insane, at least like in comparative, context for things that have come before. But there's a whole bunch of reasons why FDR wants this passed. Not only is it going to, provide us like a safety net for people who become disabled or can't work, but it does a whole bunch of things. It disposes of excess workers because old people are much more likely to retire. And so like all these people who have been competing for wages against each other and driving wages down, you suddenly reduce the labor supply. And that's going to bring wages back up. And that's kind of what goes to the second point here, is that it's going to bring wages up. And it's going to hopefully raise the living standards of these workers because again, you're providing a pension for them when you retire. It's not just like all of a sudden you stop working and if you haven't saved anything, you're just out of luck. Okay, now there is a little bit of drama though that happens with the Second New Deal, and as well as I guess this should include the First New Deal as well, and that is it involves the Supreme Court. Okay, so when we get to the latter, I guess, stages of the New Deal and Second New Deal, the Supreme Court starts making a whole series of decisions. The AAA, which was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, okay, you might remember that one from our activity. That kind of like sets prices for certain things and government would buy excess crops, et cetera, et cetera. And then also the NRA, the National Recovery Act, it sets those to be unconstitutional. Okay, and I would encourage you to go back and look at the AAA and the NRA in that activity we did from last lesson to see why those are so controversial, okay? Because they do kind of cut against the grain of the whole idea of laissez-faire capitalism that the United States has had up until this point. Now, with the Supreme Court starting to strike down all of these acts as unconstitutional, Roosevelt basically starts to see his baby New Deal start to collapse. And he does not want this to happen. So what he starts to do is he responds with what is called the court packing plan. And basically to protect his New Deal, he would put in this plan, at least it was going to be made constitutional, or at least through an act, where he could force Supreme Court justices to retire at 70, and then he could even add on extra judges on top of that. And so the ideal is that for those judges that were voting against New Deal programs, he would be able to force them to retire, and even if they didn't retire and they were under that age 70 limit, he could simply add more people that were supportive of the New Deal and kind of reduce by percentage the influence of their vote. Now, what gets really interesting about this is like FDR is trying to do good things from his point of view, but doing them in a way where, it seems like you're almost kind of breaking the Constitution in a way, kind of for a lot of people was a definite turnoff. Now, to be clear, this, for factual information, there's actually no number that's ever listed in the Constitution in terms of the justices that the Supreme Court has to have. He could have added as many as he wanted to, as long as I guess it keeps it odd, because that helps break ties. But it does really backfire. Even most Democrats at this point won't support Roosevelt's idea to do this, but the Supreme Court essentially, once Roosevelt starts making this very publicly known that this is what he wants to do, they start to change their tune a little bit. They begin to support New Deal programs that otherwise they might not have supported in the first place. And I would encourage you to click this button down here for kind of John Green's take on this. He does a really good job kind of explaining that and hashing that out. But if we can see there that Supreme Court starts to have some doubts about the constitutionality of these things, Roosevelt's like, I'll pack your court full of people that, that you don't want to be there and that will reduce your power. And the court's like, okay, fine, I guess we'll start to kind of play along. And that is one of the later dramas that the New Deal goes through. Okay, so go ahead and complete your exit ticket for this lesson, and that's all I've got for you on the second New Deal. Until next time, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.